Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Hey guys, we're your hosts M and J, and today the two of us are talking about a kind of interesting article from Syfy Wire. After months of the media really jumping on this bandwagon of condemning and hating on the original He-Man and She-Ra, now suddenly they're praising it and saying that it was actually good, and a lot of good came from it. This is really frustrating because if they're saying these things now, they could have been saying these things from the beginning, and it would have helped to avoid a lot of the misinformation about the original show that ended up being out there. Ever since Netflix's She-Ra was even announced, there had been a lot of accusations thrown at the original, not just by the media, but even by the showrunners behind the Netflix show. We talked about that a little bit when we went over that Teen Vogue article, but in multiple interviews, whether it was live or published by a magazine, they were largely passive-aggressive towards the original. At first, they give the show some general praise, like that it was groundbreaking for having a majority female cast, but then they would turn around and say that the characters were one-dimensional and static, and they were mostly there to be attractive to play into the male gaze, even though the show was targeted at a young female demographic. And it often came off as slut-shaming or even body-shaming the originals, basically reducing them to their looks and ignoring their character traits and any kind of development they had. Like they have to hold down the originals so they can lift up their own work. I think that because the cast and crew were so passive-aggressive about the original, it gave a lot of media outlets the idea that they could just be plain aggressive to the original and its fans. There were a lot of outrageous claims that were very hurtful and dismissive about the fans and also the people who worked on the original, suggesting that we're all a bunch of perverts and other nasty things. People who read these articles and weren't that familiar with the original shows just ended up picking up these really harmful ideas and spreading this misinformation. The media kept saying that the original She-Ra and her friends were all scantily clad and existed for the male gaze, and because of that, people got this idea that the original animators were just creepy weirdos who wanted to draw sexy women, which was especially bad because a lot of people had the idea that the original characters were teenagers, which not only would be creepy, it would also set unrealistic expectations for young girls. But the reality was that the characters were meant to be adults, over 18, even Noelle Stevenson, Netflix She-Ra's showrunner, has stated that. But also a lot of the animation for the original series were done with rotoscoping, which is an animation technique where animators actually trace over live action footage. So these were real actors that they were using as a base for these characters. These are pretty awful accusations of the original animators. It's really bringing their character into question, and it's not fair to do that without the facts. It's actually really harmful, and whether they meant to do that or not, that's what ended up happening. Another common jab at the original is that the people behind it were creatively bankrupt because it was nothing more than a glorified toy commercial. And since She-Ra was a spin-off of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, it was even worse because that was just a cash grab of a cash grab, basically. But even this article talks about the people who worked on the show and brought it to life and how they were very creative people, and some of them went on to do really cool things, like Paul Dini, who was involved in Batman the Animated Series, among others. And they could have been reporting on all this months ago. The article itself is really interesting. It talks about how Filmation was already interested in making a Conan the Barbarian style show when Mattel approached them to do some animation for a commercial for their new He-Man line. Filmation decided that this would actually make a really great show, so they approached Mattel. Mattel was having trouble marketing the toy line anyway, so they let Filmation have creative control over the project. Filmation ended up creating a lot of the show from scratch, including the entire planet of Eternia, and later Etheria. Mattel actually didn't finance any of the project, so Filmation had to come up with the money. Because of that, they had a really tight budget, and that ends up showing a lot in the animation. There's a lot of reused walk cycles, run cycles, but despite that, they had a lot of heart, and the important things things like the story and the characters and the worlds managed to come through. They also had to deal with concerned parent groups who didn't want anything too violent to be aired for children, so Filmation had to bend to their standards, and I think that's what caused a lot of the campiness of the show. The campiness might not have aged well, but it's what they had to do to get it broadcast in the first place. They talk about how He-Man ended up being a big success even from the beginning. That success ended up leading to a lot of opportunities, including She-Ra. The whole franchise ended up being really successful with a very diverse audience. They go on to praise the reboot and the showrunner for continuing their legacy of being inclusive. They really only have nice things to say about it, so it's really sad that the cast and crew of the reboot are so passive-aggressive to the original. Syfy Wire had a live interview with the cast and crew of the reboot. In that interview, Bo's current voice actor said that he watched a few clips of the original, and whether he meant to or not, he really ended up throwing the original cast and crew under the bus, saying the original Bo was mechanical, and that he was a middle-aged, mustachioed white man. I don't know where the middle-aged came from. He's clearly not middle-aged. But he said he was amazed at what the current showrunner was able to do with it, as if the original had no merit. I would actually recommend that you read this new Syfy Wire article. It's really interesting, and we're just kind of skimming through it, but there's a lot of really cool stuff in here. I just wish we had gotten it months ago. When reboots are announced, there's always going to be people who are skeptical, and it's understandable. These shows left a big impact on a lot of people, and they want to make sure that those aspects of the original are represented correctly. If they had just been respectful towards the original to begin with, then there wouldn't have been so much animosity in the community. Reboots are trying to get the name recognition so that way they can capitalize on the original fan base and increase their viewership, but instead it was like this one was actively trying to push fans away, and in the end it was just really unnecessary. In the same Syfy Wire interview, Noelle Stevenson was asked about the negative responses towards the show, but Noelle said that where she was sitting, it was mostly positive. Honestly, it's hard to believe that they didn't hear any negative criticism given how much of it there was, so they must have blocked it all out and just surrounded themselves with what they wanted to hear. And it's really not a good idea as a creative to block out all criticism, because you'll never improve that way. The media decided to dismiss all of the criticism as coming from perverts and bigotry, which wasn't really a fair representation of all of the things that people were saying. Yes, there were people who were saying things that were pretty rude and uncouth and not being the most constructive in their criticism. Unfortunately, those things are going to happen anytime someone tries to put their work out there. But dismissing all criticism as falling into that category ended up throwing gasoline on the fire. And that misrepresentation also ended up burying a lot of constructive criticism. It also led to people attacking anyone who had a dissenting opinion against the show. There were lots of reasons why people were concerned about She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. Not just the character designs, but also the inconsistent art style, the poor pacing, among others. We have an entire video series talking about it. While there are some good ideas in the show, they just aren't executed very well. And oftentimes, it doesn't even feel like She-Ra. And we think it's important for a reboot to have the same spirit and heart as the original. But when the showrunners seem to have this disdain for the original, how could that possibly happen? It's really easy to dismiss all criticism as coming from haters or even worse, bigots, because that way you don't have to listen to any of it. But that's a really harmful thing to do. It ends up throwing fans of the original under the bus, suggesting that they only liked it because they thought the character designs were attractive, and not because of the story or the world building or the character traits. Women who were fans of the original end up getting completely ignored, and male fans are portrayed in some of the worst light. The way the media decided to respond to the backlash didn't help at all, because now fans felt like they were being attacked. This whole thing really ended up hurting customer relations, and I think that was a pretty big mistake. If this had been their attitude from the beginning, it really would have helped to bridge the gap between original fans and the new reboot. Not to say that there wouldn't have been any backlash at all, but it definitely would have been a big help. The whole thing was very unprofessional, and I think think that fans expect better. But that's just our thoughts on the matter. Hopefully, because Syfy Wire came out with this piece, other news media outlets will follow and be more fair to the original and the fans of it. Season 2 of Netflix She-Ra is coming in April, so maybe they're just changing their approach because they realize what they've been doing hasn't been effective. It would be really sad if that is the case, but at least we got this article that gave the original cast and crew a place to speak and let their voices be heard. But what do you guys think? Let us know in the comments down below. If you liked this video, you can subscribe to this channel for more content like this. We have a whole video series about She-Ra that you can check out if you're interested in. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next video. Bye! Bye, everyone.